Hello and welcome to the lecture for chapter number 6. This is a lecture on group culture, speaking rather broadly. And before we can actually talk about group culture, we kind of need to step back a little bit and think back to a few lectures ago where we talked about variables. If you recall, we talked about how we quantify issues related to group dynamics, group communication, group processes largely. We talked about 3 different types of variables: input variables, throughput variables, and output variables. And if you recall, those input variables are the things that individuals bring to the table when they meet with groups. Previous skills, education, resources, those are the input variables. And the output variables are the overall group success. But we want to step back and revisit the throughput variables. And so if you remember, throughput variables, simply explained, are really all about the group process. There are things like roles, status, power, hierarchy, decision-making, problem-solving, socialization. They're all about the group process, or more specifically, the group's culture. And so we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about culture in this lecture. And this is a theoretical chapter, but we're going to make it a little simple. Not overly simple, but we're going to explain it in terms of the movie Mean Girls, because I think that's a great way to understand the dynamics of group culture. So like I mentioned, we're going to watch some of this in class. We're going to talk about it in class. We're going to do some things that illuminate the things we talk about. But we're going to cloak this lecture in Mean Girls, one of my all-time favorite movies. But before we talk about that, let's actually talk about the theoretical component. We cannot talk about group culture without talking about the theoretical undergirdings of how we understand group culture. And probably the most cited theory or theoretical background to talk about group culture is that of structuration theory, which is a rather deep theory, but quite simply says this: that the concept of groups can only be understood in light of communication. Groups constantly create and recreate themselves through individuals and the group's collaborative communication behaviors. Basically, this group's communication both establishes and limits how the group develops. So we can only understand groups, and groups can only understand themselves in light of the way that they communicate with each other. We know that any social system's rules, operating procedures, and resources emerge out of the verbal and nonverbal communication practices between members. Think about it. Think about your experience in groups in the past. Without communication, you would not be a group. How we understand ourselves in light of group membership and the practices of that group are all bound to our ideas and our experiences with communication. We see a key word in here. We say that any social system's rules are bound in communication. It's important that we talk about rules. Rules are a very, very integral part of understanding group culture. So we define rules as this: they're simply guidelines for how actions are to be done. So no different than how we understand rules in regular life. We also saw the key word resources, which I think is another word that we have to hash out. Resources, are those aspects of a group that are used by members to control the behavior of other members. So these are related a little bit more closely to the input variables that we talked about earlier. So thinking about Mean Girls, and we're going to see some of this in class, we know that there are rules for any group. Maybe more advanced rules for more advanced groups, but in Mean Girls we see that on Wednesdays we wear pink, as Karen says up here in the left-hand corner. That's one of the rules that defines the group. Down here we see Gretchen Wieners talking about how friends cannot date other friends' ex-boyfriends because it's against the rules of feminism. These are silly, of course, but they show us a little bit about the role that rules play in creating and cultivating group culture. We know the resources are also present in Mean Girls, as evidenced by the burn book, which causes a lot of problems in the movie. But those are resources. There's power tied up in this resource. Resources can also be individual people or leaders, as seen here with Regina. Her power is a resource to the group. It can get things done. So don't think of resources only in tangible means. They can also be other things as well. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this in class. With any theory or any discussion of theory, it's important not to just hash out what the theory says, but it's important to look at the assumptions of that theory. What are its strengths? What are its weaknesses? And so we're going to have a more critical discussion about theory later, but I want to talk a little bit about some of the most basic assumptions, of structuration theory. And the first one is this: the behavior of group members is constrained by many things, but perhaps things such as the general rules of society in which they live, the structures of the particular group in which they find themselves, and the behavior of other members. So thinking about that a little bit more simplistically, there are things that guide how a group can and should operate. There are things you can do and things you can't do. Those things are governed by society, the group itself, and then the role that individual members play in that group. We also know that people can choose whether or not to follow the rules of the group. They must make a conscious decision. They don't have to. There's nothing binding them to those rules other than a commitment to group culture and unity, which we're going to talk about later on in this lecture. We also know that group creation is a process, and it's a communication process. We create ourselves initially, and also we continually recreate ourselves. We're constantly changing. We're constantly evolving. Those may be big changes or they may be small changes, but we're always in a state of becoming as a group. But communication is really the instrument by which we create and continuously recreate ourselves. So that's a really huge idea in this chapter, the idea that communication creates groups. And that may seem to put a lot of responsibility on communication. And the more you get into the research on small group communication processes, you'll find that yes, it's a large responsibility for communication, but it's a really, really solid way of understanding groups and group culture. So, let's talk about adaptive structuration theory. We talked about structuration theory, which typically is associated with face-to-face context. Adaptive structuration theory is just one step beyond that. It's a version of structuration theory that talks about the rules and resources of computer technology. And think about this. This is something that's becoming more and more salient for us to consider. In class, you can always ask me your questions. So taking it from an adaptive structuration theory, you can also email me your questions, but it would be inappropriate in our group interactions for you to Facebook your questions to me, right? There are rules that govern our interactions. That's the basic idea behind adaptive structuration theory. There's a lot more to it than that, but I don't feel that that's a very important part of this lecture. It's something we're going to talk about later on this semester when we talk about social media campaigns, online communication, online group collaboration. There's also an entire class about this. There's two classes actually, communication on the internet and then distributed organizational communication, both of which cover adaptive structuration theory in a little bit more depth. So here's a bit of an overview, but not something we're going to get into too far this semester. So let's switch gears a little bit and think a little bit more inductively about group culture. We know that in any given group composite, there are two basic types of concerns. There are socio-emotional concerns, and then there are task concerns. So as group members, we really cannot look past the fact that groups are made up of people. And where there are people, there are interpersonal needs. There are relationship needs. And there are relationships, whether those are successful relationships or not. But there's also a reason around which we cluster ourselves, right? Especially when we're thinking about small groups. There are tasks which bind us as a group. So the balance between these socio-emotional concerns and these task concerns lead to two different types of tension. The first is primary tension, and then the second is secondary tension. Primary tension is simply this. It's the discomfort that really stems from those interpersonal sources. It's the social unease or reluctance that occurs when we don't really want to communicate with others but know that we have to. It's really that awkward part of being in a group. But tasks at all aren't awkward, but they're still a source of tension. This is secondary tension. But it's those tasks that give us that tension. It also happens interpersonally, but typically because of a difference of opinion or another member's reluctance to participate in a task, perhaps. It's not as much awkward, like the primary tension, as it is hostile. It's where disagreement really becomes salient. The chapter talks a little bit more about this, but I think this is a basic overview. It's something we're going to see when we watch Mean Girls in class. But perhaps one of the biggest reasons for these concerns is closely related to the roles that members play. So I want you to think back to our previous lecture and remember how crucial it is to find your lane and stick in it. We talked about that in the chapter on members and their roles, and a lot of these issues that we're talking about in this lecture are really closely related to that lecture, specifically in terms of status and power hierarchies. We know that really in any given group, status and power hierarchies really come into play. Status, most basically defined, is the position of a member in that hierarchy of power. So the basic questions are you a leader or are you a follower? Or which step of leadership or followership do you fall into? Those with higher status are often given a little leeway and they're avoided opportunities, more opportunities than those lower on the totem pole do not have. Specifically, the textbook highlights 3 specific types of credit or status that are given to people based on their role and their place in the power hierarchy. The first is idiosyncrasy credit. And there's a lot to idiosyncrasy credit. The book defines it rather simply, but I think it works for this discussion. It's the additional leeway in adhering to group norms that people of higher value or people who provide more to the group are given. So if you provide more time to a group, if you work more hours, you're given a little bit more leeway about how you have to or are expected to adhere to the rules that the group has set for themselves. There's also something called ascribed status, and this is status that's due to the characteristics external to the group. So if you're wealthy outside of the group, or you have a higher education, or even if you're physically attractive, you might be given a higher place in the group. Even though it has nothing to do with the group's overall success, those characteristics that happen outside of the group that would typically be regarded well in society might give you a higher ascribed status. And then there's something called earned status, which is status earned by members' valuable contributions to the group. So you're working hard, you're providing the needed expertise, you're being especially competent and especially supportive, therefore you've earned a higher position on the totem pole. All these are very, very basic, but they really inform our thinking about the role that we as a member play in the overall group culture. So think about the status of the credit you've been given in the past or that you expected in the past and how that's influenced your overall group communication competency and your overall group communication practices. So there's a lot there. We're going to switch gears a little bit again and talk a little bit more about how group culture is socially constructed. And once again, we're going to cloak that in some theory and some theoretical undergirding, specifically talking about fantasy chains and fantasy themes. Now, if you've taken any other communication courses, you've likely come across these before. There are a lot of interpretations about fantasy theme analysis, fantasy chains, fantasies in general. We're going to take an organizational communication perspective to explaining these. Before we do that, we first must understand what a fantasy is and how it applies to group communication. Fantasies, broadly speaking, are statements not pertaining to the here and now of a group that offer a creative and meaningful interpretation of the events, the meetings, or the group in general, the things that the group is doing. So when groups collaborate, they build on this fantasy and create what's called a fantasy chain, which then lead to fantasy themes, which are ultimately the underlying content of the actual message. So there's a dramatization of reality, and there's something called a symbolic artifact. We know that the way we communicate about ourselves largely is a fantasy, chains out, and becomes a fantasy theme. This is rooted in an idea called symbolic convergence, which says that humans create and share meaning through talk and storytelling. They produce an overlapping, often private, symbolic world, and that's what we use, to understand ourselves and our functions. There are many ways to understand this. The textbook highlights some related to group processes, but we see fantasy themes in action all the time. From a PR perspective, when we think about fantasy theme and fantasy theme analysis in the public relations world, we think about how advertisers try to sell us things and what they're really trying to sell us. So think about, a shampoo commercial, right? The real goal there is to sell you the idea that our shampoo is better than other shampoos, but they're not selling you a shampoo, they're selling you an idea. You see a woman or a man on the ad who is shampooing their hair and is whisked off to a world of ecstasy, right? That's a fantasy theme. It whisks you away from the here and now, what's really going on. There's a parallel to the message that they're trying to send you, but really they're selling you an idea, they're selling you a fantasy. That's what happens in the most basic idea of fantasy theme analysis. In group settings, let's think about this in small group settings. It looks a little bit more like this. We can meet as a group and somebody will say, hey, did you hear that the other group is doing a 5K to raise money and that they've already raised $2,000? That's a little bit embarrassing. And then we go on and talk about how we're embarrassed that we don't measure up to them. That embarrassment is a fantasy. It takes us away from the here and now. It talks a little bit more about socio-emotional concerns, about some other things that are not directly related to the overall task. I think that that's a good explanation. I don't think it's as deep as what it should be. We're going to talk more about fantasy themes in class, especially as they come to fruition in Mean Girls. And actually, speaking of Mean Girls, we do see a lot of fantasy themes and fantasy theme analysis in Mean Girls. Particularly the scene that comes to mind is when Gretchen Wieners goes off in her English literature class about how we should totally stab Caesar. And if you haven't seen the movie, you'll understand this a little more on Wednesday and Friday. This has nothing to do, her rant has nothing to do with the literature that she's reading. It has everything to do with her personal problems with Regina George. She's paralleling those, she's creating a fantasy theme. So we're going to talk more about this. We're going to go a little bit deeper. This is a deep theory. I don't think that the textbook actually does a sufficient enough job outlining it, so we'll talk about it a little bit more. Let's talk about some of the functions of fantasy. Why is this important to talk about specifically in regard to small group communication? Well, we know that fantasies help group members create the group's unique identity. Again, if groups are communicatively constructed, we have to understand how they're communicatively constructed, and fantasy themes allow us a little bit more insight into that process. They also help groups deal with threatening or difficult information that members might feel reluctant to address directly. Again, fantasy themes are an indirect way to address an underlying problem typically, especially in small group communication context. So it allows the opportunity to dialogue about something in a more creative and liberating way that has less personal consequence oftentimes. They also help direct a group's actions by subtly endorsing or condemning particular courses of action. Again, not being direct, but doing it rather indirectly through creative means, through a way that's less threatening, less face-threatening more specifically. And they also serve as entertainment fun. They allow us to take a trip away from the here and now, what's going on actually in the group, to reframe what we're doing as a whole. They can offer some hope, they can offer additional insight, they can give us a creative reinterpretation of what the group is and what the group does. So as you can imagine, fantasy theme analysis is closely related to group socialization. And socialization, broadly defined, is how we become socialized in a group. It's how we learn the rules, how we learn the norms, how we learn the structure of the group and acclimate to those rules, norms, and structures. We most basically define the textbook, defines group socialization as the social influence and change process during which both newcomers and established members adjust to one another. So when we bring in a new member to the group, it's not as simple as just saying, hey, welcome here. We adapt, we shift, we change. As we talked about a few slides ago, we do that communicatively. And we know that there are different phases of socialization. It doesn't just happen. It happens in steps. Let's talk a little bit more about socialization before we rush into those steps. We know that socialization, broadly speaking, is the adapting and adjusting that happens when new members join a group, and it happens via communication. But good socialization, effective socialization, requires a balance between individual member and group goals and satisfaction. Socialization is an ongoing process. It not only involves that new member, but also the rest of the group. Those roles shift. The group is no longer what it once was. It is now something different, and we all have to adapt. So let's move on and talk about how socialization happens. Let's talk about it in phases. And the textbook highlights four: the antecedent phase, the anticipatory phase, the encounter phase, and the assimilation phase. And then there's also another phase that the book kind of briefly mentions, but we'll think about it as an entire phase, and that is the exit phase. So let's first talk about the antecedent phase. This happens prior to the socialization process. It's the phase in which group members' individual characteristics affect their readiness and willingness to socialize members effectively. And this is totally related to mood and goes back to our lecture on group roles and group norms. If somebody's grumpy, the process is going to be different than if somebody's ready to welcome a new member. It's what happens before, which indicated by the word antecedent. Then we have the anticipatory phase, and this happens during group socialization. It's the phase in which members' expectations of each other and the group, so not only their expectations of each other as individuals, but their expectations of the group as a whole, really set the stage for what's going to occur during socialization. So if you were going to bring in a new member, how you feel about that new member is going to influence how they are socialized. Also, how that new member understands you as a group is going to influence how he socializes or how she socializes. So say, for instance, somebody says, that group is awesome. That member's going to come in, probably be a little bit more excited. But you as a group might have different insight. You might understand this individual that's coming in as somebody that's going to come in and cause a lot of problems. So how you socialize them is going to be highly influenced by how you understand them. So it's that anticipatory phase, how you understand what's going on, what's happening, or what's about to happen. Then we have the encounter phase. And this is also during group socialization. It's the phase in which member expectations meet the realities and members begin to kind of adjust to each other in actuality. So here's where you adjust to the group norms, the group culture, the climate, the status and power hierarchy, the leadership structure, a variety of things. It's really that new negotiation process that happens when new members come in. You're negotiating what the group is now that this member is a part of you. Then we have the assimilation phase, and this happens during group socialization, It's the phase in which members are fully integrated into the group and its structures. It's no longer awkward, it's no longer weird. You understand what the group is, what it's about, and how to navigate those norms, those rules, those power structures and hierarchies. You're now fully assimilated. And then there's one more that the textbook, again, highlights very, very briefly, but I think it's an important one. It's the exit phase. And it's really, really important to understand for this class because your groups are ad hoc groups. When this semester ends or when the project ends, your groups will meet no more. Many groups are not like that, but yours is. So you're going to see the exit phase in action. It's the phase that encompasses the process that members experience when someone leaves the group or the group disbands. So we know that really group turnover is really, really common. You're not going to face turnover here because, again, you're an ad hoc group, but in the future it's something you might face. And as you can imagine, just like when you bring in a member, when you lose a member, things change. The group changes. Again, it's not what it once was. So these are the phases of socialization. We'll see them in play when we watch Mean Girls on Wednesday. But be thinking about how those come to fruition. Do they happen in order? Do they happen out of order? Are they always present, or are they sometimes present, sometimes not? There's a lot of tricky things related to phases of socialization, and we'll talk a little bit more about those later. Let's switch again, kind of back up a little bit, and talk about the encounter and assimilation phases even more, a little bit more deeply, these two phases right here. In those times, we think quite a lot about group roles and norms because you have to encounter those and then you have to adjust to them. After all, you wouldn't need to adjust to a group if there wasn't something to adjust to. So let's define those a little bit more. Group rules are simply this. They're statements prescribing how members of a small group may or should or must, behave. Sometimes these are stated formally, sometimes they're stated in writing, sometimes they're just assumed. And when they're assumed, those are norms. So norms are basically unstated rules. They're informal. They're enforced typically by a form of peer pressure, and that peer pressure then governs the group. So norms can be something like how you dress. Is it okay to show up in sweatpants and jeans, or do you have to wear a suit? A lot of times that's not going to be dictated for you. It might be in a more corporate culture, but in some of your fields, like education, there's no formal rule for how you're supposed to dress. A norm is what guides that. They can be things like how you speak and when. Is it okay to swear? Can you say the S word? Can you say the A word? Is there a rule about that? Probably not. There's a norm. Again, how you dress, how you talk about certain things, what to talk about, what types of language can be used. Those are norms. We'll see this in Mean Girls. I have some examples up here, which we won't talk about for sake of time because the lecture is running a little bit long today. But be thinking about rules and norms. This is something we are going to talk about when we watch Mean Girls, again, more closely. But rules and norms are important because you understand the group better by adapting to the rules and norms, and you show your commitment to that group by committing to those rules and norms. But what if a norm is problematic? What if it's something that needs to be changed? If it's not a formally written, formally documented rule, how do you go about changing it? Well, there are some steps, and we're going to highlight these really briefly. First, before you can change anything about the group, including norms, you must have first establish yourself as a loyal member of the group. So show that you have an investment in this group, in these groups' processes, and in their overall success. Then, carefully observe the dysfunctional norm and the effect it has on the group. Don't just assume at first glance that it's problematic and it needs to be changed. Take a step back and critically evaluate that norm or even the rule and see what its overall effect is on the group. Then, pick an appropriate time and share your observations calmly and clearly. Ask if others share your concerns. If it's easier for you, jump back to our slides about fantasy themes. Frame it in some creative ways that are less face-threatening. Enlist other members in changing the norm. Don't make this a sole effort, me against the world. Make it something where you're being collaborative. You're modeling collaborative citizenship and participating with other members in the group to create a better group culture and group climate. And that group climate is another key thing, which we're going to end on in this lecture. Group climate is I cannot say that word. Group climate is especially associated with cohesiveness. And we need to talk a little bit about cohesiveness as a whole. When we think of cohesiveness, we know that there are also some steps in being able to create a successful group climate. You need to be able to get to know each other. You need to set clear and achievable group goals. You need to treat members with care and respect and develop group identity. Always stress teamwork. Recognize member accomplishments. Reward and celebrate group accomplishments. Support agreement and disagreement, which is not always a bad thing. And then have fun. We know that there are some differences between supportive and non-supportive climates. The book highlights these a little more specifically, but if groups are constructed via communication, we can probably guess that supportive climates are also constructed or not constructed via communication. Our communication behaviors really help structure the climate as a whole. And so I've listed a table here, which I'm not going to go into. We're going to talk more about this in class. If you check out page 171 of the textbook, you'll see a little bit more of an explanation for this table, but a supportive climate is a climate of description versus evaluation. So an example of that is in a descriptive supportive communication environment, you try to understand others' points of view. You take responsibility for your own opinions and your own beliefs. But in an evaluation, defensive communication climate, you judge, criticize, blame other people. All of these on the left are the positive supportive communication climates that we want to foster. And over here on the right, these are ones that we do not want to foster. If you take a look at page 171, you'll see a little bit more of an explanation there. Again, we'll revisit this later in class. We're going to end by talking about team building. Harking back to the slide 2 slides ago, the last thing the book suggests for you as a group to do is have fun. Team building is not all about being centered around a task. That's a large part of it. But one way that you can increase group cohesiveness and group success in general is team building, which team building is simply a set of planned events designed to increase cohesiveness. It's going out for drinks and not talking about the project that you're working on, or maybe talking about that project but in a more casual way. Doing things that help contribute to the group's overall climate, the interpersonal needs of each group member. Now, there are obviously rules about appropriateness. There's some team building guidelines, such as you should always define the purpose of the team building activity. You want to go out for drinks and not talk about what's going on? Then define that so people know. Take the group out of its normal setting. If you always meet in Bailey Hall 110, don't meet in Bailey Hall 110 for a team building activity. Go down to Mass Street, go do something different to help take your mind off the task at hand. Always plan and have a clear objective. Don't just say, hey, let's hang out and not do anything. Always have a clear objective. Again, keep the project in mind. If there's a project you're working on, which in this course you are, always think about how these team building exercises can help with the overall project success. And then help group members appreciate the strength in their own diversity. Again, we have harped on diversity every single class period that we've met in some way, shape, or form. Make sure that you're always thinking about the role that diversity plays in the group's overall success. And then stay tuned to the importance of blending work and meaningful ritual. And that quite simply means take yourself out of that traditional setting that you're in, be able to work on something in a different way through different processes, because you'll likely have a better outcome. So, as a whole, there's a lot to this chapter. I think it's one of the longest chapters in the textbook. This lecture really highlights some of the most important things, but certainly not all the things. You'll need to read the chapter as well. Your study guide is due based on the information found in this lecture and Chapter 6. If you have questions, bring those to the class. As always, we'll discuss the things found in the lecture and found in the textbook in class. We will be watching Mean Girls to help reinforce some of these things. You'll have a little bit of an activity related to that. And I hope you'll really start to think about group culture, especially as you're starting to meet with your groups and planning to raise money for the Guide to eSafe Center. So as always, if you have any questions, please send me an email, pewagner@ku.edu. I'd be happy to answer those, and I look forward to our discussions in class about group culture. Have a fantastic day.